Welcome to the 3Haunted podcast, where we bring you all things horror, supernatural, folklore, mythology, and all things that go bump in the night.
Hey, what's up, guys? I'm your co-host, Kevin, K-Daddy from Dirty South, the ATL, Hotlanta, Georgia. I'm a post-production master, filmmaker, and horror nerd.
Hey guys, this is your co-host Ashley, Gorilla Girl filmmaker, lunar goddess, and cinephile.
And I'm your co-host, John Thomas, ghost hunter, super smartass, and film lover extraordinaire.
What's up, ghouls, gals, and space-exploring pioneers? In today's podcast, we're discussing parallel dimensions, black holes, and wormholes. Are wormholes really portals to another world? Is there another version of me roaming around out there? God, I hope not. One of me is enough. What is on the other side of the black hole? Join us as we discuss this and more. We also have a special guest joining us today.
But first, here's Ashley with a word from our podcast network.
Are you looking for more awesome podcasts? Head on over to withoutyourhead.com for access to the Without Your Head podcast network, where you'll find a variety of podcasts sure to keep you entertained and coming back for more.
And welcome back. As Ashley said, thank God there's only one of her, right? I'm just kidding. I had to go there. I'm sorry. No, actually, I think having two of you would be pretty cool.
I do think one of me is enough. We lost John. Hopefully he'll join back in.
All right. Well, like you said, we do have a very special guest today. David, welcome back. How are you?
I'm doing very good, and thank you very much to you guys, to you Kevin, to you John, and you Ashley for having me back.
You're so gracious. I always love having you just in our bubble, in our space bubble.
Interspace bubble.
Hey.
So is this the point where we start talking about the fact that John has been swallowed into another dimension, another universe?
Pretty much.
John is
scary, guys. Don't go there.
John is like time traveling in and out of other dimensions as we're doing this.
John,
he just blips out and blips back in.
He fell into one of those black holes.
He fell into the black hole.
I did. I don't know how I got out, but yeah.
I think most people would want to know how that happened. Okay, so everybody, we're talking about parallel dimensions, wormholes, and black holes today. And I know there's like infinite scientific research that goes into these topics, quantum theories, and just all of the math and science. But let's take a stab at our own theories and see what sticks, what happens, what we believe.
Like you said before, people talk about the scientific applications of these ideas, but I'm just kind of curious for the three of you, going back into your childhood, when would you say in your life you became aware of the ideas or the concepts of either black holes or parallel universes or alternate dimensions?
Quantum leap.
Okay.
I was very young and watched that TV show faithfully growing up. And that really kind of got me into this whole idea of, time jumping and space traveling. And it was interesting because, at the end of it all, I don't know, spoiler alert, there's this group that facilitates all of that and they're in charge of that. But it's like they're taking advantage of this quantum leaping into different dimensions and different realities and different times. And so I think it's along the same timeline though, right? They're not different universes, like parallel universes. It's just jumping back and forth in time, if I remember correctly, of the same timeline. So that really, I think, was the first exposure that I can at least remember of this concept of quantum physics in terms of traveling outside of your own time and space of the here and now, the present.
I'm going to go to one maybe Kevin knows. Actually, I think he does know. It's another TV show called Sliders. Remember Sliders? Jerry O'Connell. And I can't remember who else was in there. But yeah, that was one of mine. Quantum Leap and Sliders.
I think the Sliders was the next kind of mainstream TV show that came out with that similar concept, right? After Quantum Leap.
Yeah, it was like in the 90s-ish. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. See, I see his face. He's like, oh yeah, I remember now.
Yep.
He knows. What about you, David?
Well, I would say for me, I'm going to date myself again. But I would say for me, it's kind of a multiple Thrawn type thing, because I think in my childhood, different concepts came to my attention at various times. I would say the one about black holes was obviously the 1979 Disney movie, The Black Hole. So then that's when I became aware of what a black hole was and what it could do. And then, of course, the movie being science fiction, it plays with the concept at the end of the movie where you get sucked in and that you're being taken to either another place spiritually or another dimension. But then there are those weird moments like in TV history, right, where there was an old episode of Mork and Mindy where Mork is trapped in another dimension. So he's like walking and talking very, very slow. And so, and the concept, if I recall at the time, was that he's not in our dimension, but we can still see him in our dimension, but he's in another dimension. And so then that was one, as when we were kids, it was like, oh, whoa, so another dimension would imply that your perception of what you're seeing might be different depending upon where you're at. So that was a cool concept there. And then when you bring up, John, like shows like Sliders and whatnot, I'm, again, because I'm older than you guys, there was an old show in the probably like the early 80s, it starred like I can't remember the name of the child actor, but he was a kind of a stringy brown-haired boy. And then the actor that was with him was at the time, he was a famous actor, but he was the one who accidentally killed himself on set, John Eric Hexum. But they had a show, and I can't remember what it was called, but they were time travelers, and they would travel to different time periods. So, growing up, if you were a kid then, growing up from the 70s, and then if you had a steady diet of like any of the science fiction stuff that you might watch on TV, like on a Saturday creature feature or something like that, the concepts of time travel, of dimensions, of black holes, or you being taken to a parallel universe, whether that parallel universe was like an alien world or if it was just an alternate timeline. I think that's when all that stuff began to kind of solidify in my own imagination.
We can't actually forget Back to the Future. I mean, come on.
Oh, yeah, no.
Like, it just hit me. I was like, oh, wait, Back to the Future.
Exactly. And to me, that's the thing that's kind of intriguing about all this, is because you have a scientific community that obviously has always tried to apply the scientific method to trying to understand these things. But then you have the rest of us who are really only getting exposed to these ideas pretty much if we're engaging with like popular culture, or if it's a film or a movie, or if it's in the comic book or something like that.
So I think the show you were talking about is Voyagers.
Yes, Voyagers, yeah.
And you mentioned dating yourself. And there's a term for when you date yourself. It's called master dating.
Okay, well then I masturbated myself.
We don't allow that on the show.
I'm sorry.
I had to. I'm sorry. Got him. All right, Kevin, what was your exposure?
I can't think of like the first experience with like black holes or wormholes, but the one that actually sticks out the most was from early 20s in Doctor Who.
Yeah,
Doctor Who, I feel like, is a huge I mean, that's more or less the whole premise of the show is time and space. And I can actually thank John for even getting me into Who. So,
and I can actually thank my daughter Lila for that, because if she didn't get me into it, then I wouldn't have gotten you into it. So therefore, boom.
It's like Inception of Doctor Who.
Exactly. Or 6 degrees of whatever.
Also, we can't forget about Twilight Zone.
Yeah, because Twilight Zone itself is like, it is the quintessential parallel universe, right?
Yeah, and I guess, just starting at the base level here, it's parallel universes, and what do you believe in when it comes to parallel universes? Like, do you believe in the multiverse? Do you believe in parallel universes that exist like layered over layer, like a quilt? I mean, what is it that you kind of, when you think about parallel universes, do you ascribe to with that? Like, what's your definition?
I guess for me, when I remove myself from how I view it from a science fiction point of view, and then I have to look at the scientific stuff. I think we might have touched on this maybe just a tiny bit the last time. There have been articles written about, because this has been going on, probably since before 2016, but the Hadron Collider, which I think is like in Geneva. So there have been all these papers written when they started using the Hadron Collider, and they were studying particle science, right? And I seem to remember that there were papers that were being written that one of the things that they were pursuing in their study was they were looking for proof of parallel universes. And one of the ways that they were looking for that was they were looking for mini black holes. And I want to say that they had worked out a scientific method that they thought that they could validate the existence of the mini black holes, which would then validate the existence of parallel universes by this thing I think called like rainbow gravity. And I forget exactly how it would work, but it would be that these mini black holes, even if they're in another dimension, that they have an effect on gravity that could be perceived. So, I mean, it's a bunch of heady stuff. And it's stuff that's way beyond my pay grade for sure. But when I think about a parallel universe in that term, I guess the closest thing I can come to is that I imagine a parallel universe would be like another vertical slice of where we are and what we are. But maybe there is some kind of deviation that is going on in that universe. Or maybe it's a multitude of billions of deviations that are going on, but that it's still looking at the same type of matter or the same type of material, but that it is playing out in a different way, or that there are different effects on it, you know? So for me, it's very easy to imagine that there is a parallel universe where there is me, there is you, there is John, there is Kevin, but that none of us ever have any contact with each other. And I know that that may sound kind of science fiction, but the way that I equate it is that I just feel like it's another slice, but it's contained. And whatever's contained within that slice is subject to its own rules that are governing, whatever happens to be the rules of gravity, or even if it's just the basic stuff of like, what happened in a person's life, or do trees grow at the same rate? Do animals have all four legs? You know what I mean? So to me, a parallel universe, I can see it being a very tangible, a very realistic thing. But then again, at the same time, I could see where scientists might show up and be like, well, a parallel universe would be something that isn't quite like that. It could only exist for, say, light, right? So that only light can exist in a parallel universe, but like organic matter can't do that. But since I'm such a rabid science fiction fan, I want to believe that parallel universes are essentially they're just like they're like another room in a house.
The small deviations that you're talking about, I don't know why it just reminds me of the butterfly effect, like where one even tiny difference in those universes could create this vastly different outcome, like to one where the four of us may have never even met or started talking.
Exactly.
Well, I think there's also like it depends on what type of universes you're ascribing to anyways before we even talk about parallel universes, simultaneously running at the same time, because it's this idea of we can guess what's outside of our universe, but we don't actually know, right? And so we have ideas and theories based on our own universe. I like even this idea of the Big Bang, that's not 100% like solid. We know for a fact that's a thing, right? But we can gauge that based on measuring the universe expansion and measuring the age of things that come across our pathway. But it's still a theory at the end of the day. And we don't know if the Big Bang was the only bang, if that's just one Big Bang, let's say it was a Big Bang, it's a thing, it's real, if that was the only one that existed out there, or were there other single forms of, that singularity of mass out there, and then boom, they all kind of went at their own rate. We know that the one that we emerged from is about 14 billion years old. And so we've come out to here. But I feel like sometimes we forget that we get lost in the scope of ego of us, right? This is how it is for us. So that must be how everything else shaped out to be. And I stumbled across this concept, this theory about the bubble universe. It's this idea of bubble universes, that there's this external inflation that occurred. So each universe that has branched out from the Big Bang has kind of external inflated that universe, but not everything inflates at the same level, the same speeds, and some inflation stops. So you have like these bubble universes, right? That are kind of all over. And then the space in between is like the inflation that stopped. Now we know ours hasn't, it's not inflating anymore, right? Or at least not currently at a speed that we can notice because our solar system is staying the same place it's at. But it's not to say it always will exist that way. It's not to say it's been that way because we've seen things like water under the surface of Mars and things like that, where once upon a time it was able to exist in a different manner. So things change, but then we assume, well, this is where we are 15 billion years from the Big Bang. Everything else must be that way. And it's like, well, that's assuming everything else followed the same speed of it, inflation and expansion. And we're only thinking in terms of what we're able to conceptualize, which doesn't necessarily equate to what actually is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
So I really liked that idea of like this concept of the bubble universes, and that's not something some hokey person made up. Like there are a lot of theories out there about how the universes are shaped. Is it a multiverse? Is it infinite universes? Or is it a combination of universes, but because we're only limited on a certain amount of time, 14 billion years of the Big Bang, so many combinations have only been allowed to come into play. I think a lot of our theories that we kind of get hung up on are based on the idea that we assume this is how space time works for everything, for every universe. And kind of like what we talked about with the aliens and UFOs, just because this is how humans form on this planet and life forms on this planet doesn't mean that something else hasn't evolved and adapted to whatever is out there in another universe on their planet within their laws of gravity and physics, which may be nothing like what ours are. So I'm a nerd.
No, but I think even at the heart of it, that's one of those conundrums that always comes up, where it's like I would be the first one to say that it's like if you were to tell me the next day that all of our scientists have been wrong about everything, I wouldn't be shocked. Because even as a kid, when you tried to wrap your head around the concept of like, well, like when you talked about the Big Bang, the idea that before this existed, that something didn't exist, right? That the infinity that we see as a universe, that it was something that it was smaller and then it grew. So then your mind goes to, well, if it was this non-existent thing, what is that space that was outside of it that it grew into? And that becomes a really hard thing to wrap your head around, right? Just like when you look at a black hole and nothing can escape a black hole, not even light. And it's like, okay, how does so much mass, how does so much energy get swallowed up and seemingly go nowhere? These concepts of like on this side is limitless, like you could spend eternity trying to find the end of it, but then that there is a barrier and that beyond it there is something else. And it's like, well, wait a minute, how can that be? How can there be a barrier to something that seems barrierless? You know what I'm saying? So these concepts, it's like I absolutely agree with you. It's like I would not expect. I mean, I have a hard time trying to wrap my own head around how our own universe may possibly work. So I wouldn't expect another universe to have to operate the same way. I mean, because I can barely figure out what this one does.
Well, and when black holes get close to each other, and then we get like the super black holes when they eventually combine, right? Well, before they're those singular black hole that's kind of engulfed into one, you have entangled black holes. So they're so close to each other that they're still impacting each other's like space-time influence around it, but they are not merged into one yet. And, I think a lot of scientists are starting to theorize that that's when you get wormholes connected between the black holes. And it's like, okay, well, if it's strong enough to influence space time that it creates a wormhole, there's got to be something there for those two to connect to each other before they're merged. It's not like they're just these galaxy garbage disposals engulfing everything and just who knows where they go. There's something there that's able to connect them to each other. And if they can connect to each other like that, so they can extend down and out into each other, there is something more inside that black hole than we know. And I know that there are scientists trying to figure out how to utilize that data, because once you open that black hole to have that wormhole connection, there's got to be a way. I think they call it like a black hole information escape or something like that, to figure out how to identify what's inside those black holes, because that whatever's connecting them, stuff is actually coming out of the center, not through the event horizon, to connect into that wormhole. So it'd be interesting to see like what's in there. So I'd like to just qualify that the entangled black holes is a theory. It's not been 100% proven, but they've done a lot of like lab research and doing their own model testing, mathematical testing, just like a lot of our science, applying what they are doing theoretically and digitally in simulations to external factors. So just to let you know, anybody listening, that is not like something that's been recorded and proven out in space.
And the truth is, until we become a spacefaring species, and until we're actually out there, a lot of this will always remain very well documented theory, but still just theory, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because once you get out into the deep cosmos, only then are you going to know, what is real and what isn't.
I think the funniest thing I read though out there was that people use this term that if you fall into a black hole, you would die via spaghettification.
That's a theory where like you'd just be stretched. Like, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yep.
So there's no more of you.
It's the diet of 2022. But you sorry.
No, that was funny.
Yes, I actually got a good joke. But you actually shut up, John. I see that. But you actually brought something up that makes me think a little bit deeper with a commonality between previous episodes about energy and how you cannot destroy energy. So if it goes into a black hole, where does that energy go? Or is that the only place that can actually destroy energy?
That's a question that I want an answer to, right? Because we're constantly told in science that you can't destroy energy, that energy doesn't die, right? So when you asked me earlier before, like, what are some of my concepts of what a parallel universe is, I can also fall into the same category where I would start to think that maybe a parallel universe would be an explanation for supposedly when we die, that whatever makes us us, we are a combination of organic matter driven by an internal energy. And even when the organic matter dies, the internal energy has to go somewhere else. So does the internal energy then exist within another dimension? So by the same token, when you think about the black holes sucking up and destroying worlds or stars or light, still that energy, I mean, it's not like an ice cream cone, like you described, a garbage disposal unit, right? Because even a garbage disposal unit has to dispose of its garbage. So that's the question. It's like, where does that all go, right? You can disintegrate stuff. I understand that, but where does the energy go?
I mean, something happens to it because they've measured and tracked black holes as it consumes the energy and masses around it. It does get bigger for a time and then, shrinks back. And I know Stephen Hawking proposed that black holes get bigger by eating material, but they also shrink because they lose tiny amounts of energy that he coined Hawking radiation. So it actually does give off energy, small amounts over time. So it might just be it consumes and then slowly converts it and radiates it out. And that space isn't as empty or a vacuum as we say it is. Because again, is it maybe something we don't know yet? We haven't been able to really identify what dark matter is, but we know it exists. So what if it is just a transition, like black holes take this positive energy, this light matter energy, and then transforms it into dark matter and then expels it out into the universe. Roll with me here for a moment. Let's just get a little crazy in our theories, right? Because that's what we do at 3Haunted Podcast. What if black holes consume things, and the reason that we can't track what's inside the black hole or even see the other side of the black hole is because we haven't fine-tuned our equipment or created the technology to identify and measure dark matter. So what if we're only seeing half of the black hole? So because we can only measure the light matter, right? We can only measure what we are. And so we measure the light matter, but then as it transitions through in that gravitational collapse, something in that collapse transforms it into dark matter and continues to generate out that dark matter that we consider is vacuum or empty space because we can't measure it yet, right? We don't have that technology. We only can measure what we are, what we know right now. And so that's a whole lot right there. So imagine though, if it's so much bigger than we see, because why is it black holes are at the center of every single galaxy and universe? And it's like, why? Because what if what it's doing is it's that yin to the yang? So we see the light, but we're not seeing that it's transitioning out and funneling out that dark matter to create that symbiosis within our galaxy, to keep those planets in alignment, to keep those stars in the center of the solar systems. And so now we're going to get even crazier. Let's take a look at life and humanity. So we're talking about like the picking up of things that aren't there and like where are these things coming from? What if parallel universes are universes that exist in the dark matter? And so maybe when we die from our light matter, like energy going into black holes, we transitioned into something else, something we can't record or measure because it's not what we are. We get lucky with our technology and pick up things that maybe does exist. Maybe it's like, maybe it is in the dark matter side. And maybe that's what these parallel universes or other dimensions or ghosts or paranormal activities actually are. It's just us transitioned into whatever is dark matter. I don't know. I'm crazy.
With the whole parallel dimensions thing, though, kind of skipping around the black holes because I don't really have much to say about that one. As a ghost hunter, like sometimes we kind of wonder if maybe who we're talking to isn't somebody who's actually dead, but it could be somebody in another dimension, basically, that's overlapping our own. And that's like what we hear when we record and get our EVPs and stuff like that, or when we hear disembodied voices, that maybe it's, just another dimension stacked up on our own. And for some reason, it glitches into ours at that exact moment or something. It's just something that I was thinking about.
Well, that does dovetail to, there are people who've had similar concepts or ideas about that when they talked about when we first began to break into radio and had the ability to receive signals, and that there were documentations of people who were getting radio signals at a time when radio didn't really exist. And it's like, well, where are these radio signals coming from? And so one of those theories had been that the possibility that they were picking up signals that were in fact coming from either another dimension or a parallel universe.
I feel like you're onto something though, Ash. Like with right, Ashley Hawkins.
Ashley Hawkins.
But I mean, if you think about, I'm just gonna make a comparison to something on Earth that we all know. And if you go back hundreds of years ago, we thought that light was what we can see, like colors, the light coming from the sun. And it wasn't until we started learning about ultraviolet and infrared light and the whole other spectrum that our eyes can't see. And so maybe you're right. Like maybe there is something else to the black hole that it's doing with what it's consuming that we just don't quite know yet, just like we didn't know about infrared and ultraviolet.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you guys had brought up two things there that I seem to recall had come up when people were talking about the stuff with the Hadron Collider. One of the things was, there were big fears about them using the Hadron Collider, about them doing a particle accelerator and all of that kind of stuff. One of the things that they talked about, but they tried to explain away in terms of trying to alleviate people's fears, was the simple fact that they admitted that they were able to create mini black holes. Now, they're very, very small. I forget what it is, but it's something like below a millimeter or something like that. But they were able to create mini black holes. But the problem that they had with the mini black holes that would manifest is that they were unstable. And as you had described earlier, Ashley, they would simply evaporate. So when people were getting really worried about, oh my gosh, you're going to create a black hole and it's going to suck the earth and destroy everything, they're like, well, no, because it would literally take billions of these mini black holes to manifest into anything that would be destructive to us. But still, even in that concept, what they were talking about, they were very, very forthcoming in the fact of like, we're able to manifest these mini black holes, but we don't know how they work. We don't know what's going on, right? But in those same discussions, like, Kevin, when you talked about light, one of the stuff I remember reading about that I never even knew, but I thought was kind of interesting, was that, different colors of light travel at different speeds. And that's another thing that like I have a hard time wrapping my head around, because it's like, well, why is that? Why does different color of light travel at different speeds? And all of these things have an effect, apparently, upon everything that we're talking about, which again is like, so if there are these little nuances to this kind of stuff, it's easy for me to make the leap as opposed to just believing in ghosts, making the belief that it's like, okay, well, the hereafter is a parallel universe. Or like you said, Ashley, maybe it's the conversion into I don't want to say it antimatter in the way that people typically think of antimatter, like you're going to blow up, but that it's the opposite of where we're at. So maybe those things that we've heard, communications or visitations, the appearance of light, right? Whether it's light orbs or the amalgamous formations of spectral light and stuff like that, that these things could be the fragments or the hallmarks of getting a glimpse of one universe bumping into another universe.
If I could add on that, but there's also been very similar theories about deja vu being a parallel universe or an alternate universe, basically coming into phase with this universe. And it's typically in those theories, it's universes that are almost mirrored, but with slight variations. And it just happens that whatever events are happening in that universe and this universe are happening at the exact same moment. And that's why you get the deja vus. You're tapping into those universes, basically.
I was actually going to bring all that up. Thank you, Kevin. That's awesome.
Well, and there's so much we don't even know about ourselves. Like, we only know the capacity that we use our brains is smaller than, we don't use the 100% full capacity of our brains. We are pretty powerful mechanisms for computing information, but we forget that we are receptors as well. We are like little mini energy tuning forks. And so, is it really that far of a stretch that there are things we can't see and measure out there, like dark matter, that exist, and we are receptive to maybe that kind of energy vibration? And that's not a meta in terms of, like, what did Callie call it? Woo woo? That's not woo woo. That's science in terms of we are receptors. And I think sometimes we get so stuck on this, I am a human and I am a thinking person with feelings, that we forget we are also organisms within a greater scientific universe that we don't necessarily understand our full capabilities and capacities as well. I think, sometimes get caught up in the idea that we give out things, we create, we understand, we acknowledge, and we learn and explore, but we forget that we can receive. We can receive energy in forms of emotion, in terms of wavelengths, in terms of light. And maybe dark matter impacts us more than we know, but we have no way of really discovering how yet, just because we don't have the tools or the resources to identify it yet. Because I know dark matter, what did they say? Okay, so I'm trying to remember exactly what I read, but it's something like dark matter produces an attractive force within the universe. So the gravitational energy that holds galaxies together is because of dark matter. And we know that because we know visible matter doesn't have enough gravitational pull to keep the galaxies together. So there's something else out there keeping the forms. We can make that assumption based on what we know about visible matter. But again, it's one of those things. There's a lot out there. There's something out there to hold galaxies together. And we can't see it, we can't track it, but we know it's out there, kind of like aliens.
It all fits, it all relates, because the stuff you were talking about right there. I mean, if I break it down for myself, right, if I just try to make it work from my own head, right, if everything that we are, if everything that we interact with, everything that we exist within is all based upon particles, we're all based upon particles upon particles upon particles that have relationships with other particles that transmit energy and information to other particles, then it would make sense that those particles would have relationships where there would be no limitation. So those particles, that when you talk about us being receivers, that it's like, why wouldn't there be some kind of, again, not to sound woo-woo, but why wouldn't there be some sort of universal connection just on that subatomic level, right? So, and if everything does break down to a particle, no matter what universe that you're in, then that would kind of imply then that everything is all related to one another anyway. So why wouldn't one thing be able to travel to another location or to be in another space, right? And again, I know this gets really heady and it gets really kind of confusing, because it's like, a person can be like, well, yeah, a particle can be here and there, But if an organic matter is comprised of particles, if the organic matter dies, well, the animal, the person, whoever dies, you don't get to go and be in another place, right? But then again, that comes back to that whole thing about like, well, if you subscribe to the idea of our souls as being energy, right? Wouldn't that imply that those are particles as well? That those particles can have an existing relationship? So why can't multiple dimensions exist? Why can't there be a parallel universe? Us as humans, like you talked about, like me, David, if I were to go get in a rocket ship and go in a black hole, I can't assume that I'm going to come through that without a scratch. You know what I mean? I would have to assume something bad is probably going to happen to me. But that doesn't mean what comprises me, what makes me up, that wouldn't end up somewhere else, right? I mean, I may be torn to shreds in terms of being a physical human being, but the things that are me it would be reasonable to expect that they would still pop up somewhere else. They would still go somewhere.
Kind of being a goofball and a smartass, but didn't Looney Tunes kind of do something with Marvin the Martian with that when he like zapped Bugs Bunny and he came back all different somewhere else? I can't remember, but I remember seeing it in a cartoon somewhere where his head was like where his butt was supposed to be, and it was just it was all weird. Yeah.
I love this topic. I love just these concepts of astrophysics because there's so much we don't know and there's so many possibilities out there. And no matter how much science and how much math and how much engineering we do, nobody has the right answer because that technology doesn't exist yet and it may never. And for me, it's like, holy cow, this is the stuff that keeps me awake on my phone until like 4 a.m. because I get sucked in. I start on one topic and then like 50 links later, it's just like 4 a.m. I love it. I love these topics. Coming back to something that John and David touched on, you had talked about receivers and potentially getting information from other universes or dimensions. And I had read this really interesting article about the Antarctic. It's like a balloon called the the Antarctic Impulsive Transient Antenna. And it records and measures and captures neutrinos, which are like high energy particles that come in from deep space into Earth. And they measure it and track it because they're trying to understand deep space and how things travel through it a little better and how it impacts Earth. And so it's set up in Antarctica. And the thing that they discovered, oh gosh, I think it was like 2018, and it baffled everybody. And it still is. Nobody has the answer yet. They're still trying to figure it out and fine tune their equipment. Is they noticed when they were going over the data that something was off because as they were parsing through it, they were finding that there were some neutrinos at a very high level. So, like a very strong amount coming up from the Earth's surface. And they're like, hold on a minute, that's not the direction it's supposed to be coming from. That doesn't make sense, especially at the level that it was at, like the saturation that it was at. It shouldn't be coming through because anything coming up from the other side of the Earth would be very like filtered through the Earth's layers of rock, and it would have diffracted and deflected and broken into many particles at that point. And these are very strong levels of direct neutrinos. And so they're like, well, that must be a fluke. So they sent it out. It's like this weather balloon type thing. Well, it's not a weather balloon, but it's this balloon that measures. And so they sent it out for another year. And the next year they measured the data and found the same exact thing. And so they have this secondary measuring tracking device that is stuck in the ground. So it's not above the surface to measure any neutrinos that deflect or diffract up from, coming in and hitting the ice. And anything that may come through the surface, like from underneath, anything that comes from there, it's supposed to measure. It's actually funny because it's named Ice Cube. And they found it wasn't picking those up at all. So it wasn't something that's coming down from our internal Earth and up through, like maybe from the other side of the Earth, right? And coming up through. So they're like, where the hell are these coming from? Because it's not coming up through the Earth. It's not diffracting down, but they're seeing them appear at the surface and go up. So they can't figure it out. They are currently trying to modify and upgrade and fine tune their equipment to see like what's happening, but nobody knows. And scientists, some scientists get excited and they're like, oh my gosh, it's parallel dimensions. It's coming from another dimension and blipping in. Because that's essentially what's happening, right? It's essentially just appearing and coming up and out. So where is it coming from?
Loved everything that you were explaining there. And that's kind of the problem that I have, or the conflict that I have when I think about these things. Because when I think about it from a scientific point of view, right, or I try to adopt the scientific point of view, which is just very pragmatic, very, okay, let's not get crazy with fantasy and stuff like that. It still becomes pretty hard to figure out, because like, as much as I love a movie like Interstellar, right, Chris Nolan's Interstellar, I absolutely love that movie. I think it's a fantastic film. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening to Matthew McConaughey when he goes into the event horizon, his ship begins to disintegrate and fall apart, and he ejects. But the ship falls apart and can't take what's happening, but he ejects, and that he in a spacesuit is existing in something, and he's fine, and he isn't subject to whatever was happening. And then, of course, whatever it is that he happens to be in, where he's able to have an effect through the time-space continuum, where he's actually interacting with his own past and the past of his daughter and his life. And then at some point, he's just thrown out of it. And then he's just picked up in space without anything happening to him. When I watch a movie like that, it's like you almost want a film to be able to handle the kind of in-depth kind of discussion that you're talking about, in terms of the science of it, to where someone, kind of like a car mechanic, can open up a book and then show you, okay, here's how we go about replacing your carburetor. You know what I mean? Where it's like, it seems like, okay, we should be able to have some kind of conceptualization of what's going on, or what are the possibilities of what's going on. Because it's like, when you talk about it in these scientific terms, it's like, oh my God, man, I could literally spend the rest of my life trying to figure this out. But yet the shortcut version that we give ourselves is always the quick science fiction take, right? Which is like, oh, this just happens because, or you just appear because. But yet something intuitively tells you there's got to be more to it. There's got to be something far more to how the universe works and how this all plays out, right? Because going back to the thing I talked about earlier, about talking about like whether I believed a parallel universe was just kind of like a vertical slice of where we are, or if it's like what you talked about, or if it's the place that we go when we die, right? All of it could be possible at the same time. When you talked about that, they're going through these steps of trying to find out, well, where are these particles coming from? And then when we try to figure out, okay, the spaghetti theory of what happens if you go into a black hole. Well, all these theories, again, none of it can really lay out concretely 100% what happens and what's going on. And to me, the only thing I can come back to is all the people who would say, well, that's not true and you don't have proof for that or whatnot. I have to come back to the same point where it's like, I have to believe that it's possible. Anything that you can come up with and tell me in regards to a parallel universe or wormholes or time travel or an alternate dimension, I have to take the default position that, you know what, dude, we're human beings and we just don't fucking know, and anything is possible.
That's going in the episode description. To your point, though, yes, people do default to science fiction, but I think sometimes science defaults on the illogical or things that don't apply because they don't want to lend into the science fiction. So they will come up with the most what sounds scientific idea they can think of. But even that's a stretch sometimes. Like with that one, with the neutrinos, they traced the eruption of supermassive black holes to some radio frequencies that were being picked up. And they said, aha, that's where maybe that's coming from. And it's like, really? But if that's the case, wouldn't your other detector, Ice Cube, have picked that up coming through? Like if these things are strong and at their pure form, why are they coming up through the same place every single time? And not being diffracted or broken down by the time they reach the surface to some extent? Why are they still pretty intact and strong? Again, I think sometimes people reach for what they hope makes sense because they don't want the can of worms of what does it mean if there are parallel universes? What does it mean if there are other dimensions? I think that scares people more. And so it's like, oh man, no, it was them black holes erupting out there. Yeah, that's what it was. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, sure. And maybe a solar flare happened that day too, but it's still not making sense. If you say this is how the patterns work, the neutrinos come in and they deflect and they refract and all those things, or they come through the earth and then they refract, they're broken up by the rock and the ice surface, then that still doesn't explain the strong untouched ones that seem to be just appearing. Right. So I don't know. I'm not sure I'm buying that one, but I mean, they're trying. They're trying to find out, but sometimes I wonder if they grasp for what, like, the first connection they can make instead of continuing to pursue further and deeper.
Well, I thought years ago there were reports that there were even experimentation going on with transporter technology. I mean, not like in Star Trek, but where they were trying to get a particle to transport from one place to another. And then once again, even in something as simple as that exercise, you have to stop and like go, if you can make that happen, if you can make a particle transport from one location to the next, doesn't that once again open up the same can of worms where it's like, okay, so what did you just travel through?
Where did you go?
What is the nothingness in between? What is that? Because obviously it can't be nothingness. Obviously there was a pathway. There was a way to get there.
Yeah, you have to exist. You don't go from, like we said, right? Energy does not get destroyed. So if you organically, as you are, that you're in one place and then you end up in another place, your organic had to be somewhere in between there. So I don't know. I'm with you.
And I kind of remember something about that, David. There was also questions about if the particle travels, is it actually still the same particle, or is it just more or less a clone of the first one? There's so many questions.
Right, yeah, and then that opens with the Pandora box. And when you go back to the same concept, right? Where it's like if you're jumping from a universe to a universe, does it come down to something like that, where you're like, well, a parallel universe is just a clone universe. Everything is a clone of a clone of a clone of a clone of a clone, and that you can never get back to the point of origin. It's always going to another version, which again would be maddening to me. It all leads to this madness of infinity. And it's like, okay, where does this go? You know what I'm saying?
But isn't that kind of what the foundation of Quantum Leap was? Like, once he left his timeline and his home, he really couldn't go back. It was always moving forward into a different body and a different space. It was still like his sentient mind, but it was always someone new, some different time, some different place, some new body. So maybe, like you said, once you're gone from where your original origin point was, there's no going back.
Well, then for future travelers, if we can get this technology to work, that's gonna suck.
Is it? Is it though? Because I think there's a lot of people out there that, given the opportunity to travel time, dimensions, and universes, they'd say, "See ya." Like, I'm good. I'm fine. On to the unknown.
I will grant you that if you were selecting a team of people and you had the technology where they could be preserved as what they are, as organic beings, and if they didn't have ties, if they didn't have families, if they didn't have connections, if you could choose people who were willing to take that risk and to voyage into whatever it is, if it's a parallel universe or a dimension, and whether that's a time difference or whatever it is, I can easily see that people would do that, you know. But then the flip side, the backside of my mind goes to, again, and this is totally wrong, this is totally bad, but because we've grown up on it, it's like I would never want to be in a situation like the Upside Down from Stranger Things, right? Where you're going to a screwed up parallel universe that is actively trying to kill you. Not necessarily because of anything other than the simple fact that you're almost like an invading cell.
But I mean, to that point, isn't that kind of what our astronauts risk? At least the first ones that go to each, and maybe not upside down universes, but like the first ones that go to a new space, whether it's the first ones that go to the moon, the first ones that go to Mars, the first ones that go to, like, you don't know what that planet's going to be like when you present your organic matter onto that surface. We have ideas, we test rovers, but that's still a machine. We don't know what it's going to do to you exactly when you put a human on a new planet. Like, is our equipment going to hold up? We have hopes. We we test out equipment and, like, okay, well, we're going to send machines first and see what happens. But We don't 100% know, but they're willing to take that chance because it's like, man, I want to be the first one to do that. I want to see what the unknown is. Like the first human that ever went into space. That's like a gamble if they're gonna thrive and exist. And you have people that are willing to go space exploration out into space for 30 years if you let them. Like it's there.
I can't believe we really haven't talked about like what is time.
And we've been talking a lot about what is space, but
Yeah.
Well,
you're right.
Isn't time considered a dimension itself?
True.
Time is a construct we use to wrap our minds around the world we exist in.
And to go to work.
They used to refer to time as the fourth dimension, right? There was a period of time when people would talk about the fourth dimension, and then it was like, well, time is the fourth dimension. But you're right, Kevin, because time is, as Einstein would say, it's relative to all of this.
For so long, it was understood to be something that was linear, right? In direct correlation with space. But now we've learned that things like black holes and the universe itself can slow down time and shape time and bend it. And it's like, even that idea that time is bent, it's like, what the fuck does that even actually mean? Just so many things. You see the shapes. You see like all of these diagrams with different shapes of how time bends and arcs and spins. And it's like, what does that mean, though, really, when you hear that time is bent? I don't know.
Wibbly wobbly, timey wimey.
You beat me to it.
I knew you were going to.
I mean, do you guys understand what bent time is?
No. Like,
well,
David knows.
Well, no, I wasn't going to say that. Go ahead, Kevin.
Like the only way that I've kind of processed it was actually we've talked about Stranger Things like a few times already tonight, but like where he basically took the I think it was the physics teacher, but he took the piece of paper and said like, this is how we perceive time, and then he folded it in half and then shoved a pencil through it and was like, this is how time could bend, where you can go from one point to the other. And that's the only way that I'm picturing how time works. What is actually bending, I have no idea, and I don't even want to pretend to like know what that is.
I mean, like in theory, it makes visual sense when we see these things, like around the black holes, where they show how the time is bent. But then when I actually try to conceptualize my brain with that, like, what does that mean, though? I don't quite understand it, because I know even like you were mentioning, David, general relativity, it's this concept that gravity can bend time. And there we go with that whole bent time. And it's like, but what does that mean? What does it look like? And not visually like the picture. I know what the picture looks like, but applying that to something, what does that mean? That time is bent?
Yeah, well, I mean, the closest I've ever come to it is just basically what Einstein had talked about, where they basically worked out that a person on the Earth will continue to age through time at a certain rate. And then an astronaut who was able to travel the closer and closer to the speed of light would actually age at a de-accelerated rate, right? But once again, the whole thing behind all of that, though, even though all the scientists agreed with that, it was like, okay, well, then that really implies you can only be a time traveler going in one direction, right? But I still have to believe, and I still have to think that there's a possibility that, well, if there's a science that can allow for that, who's to say that, again, whether it's through the black holes or parallel universe or whatever, that time doesn't have a way of doing that in the reverse, where you could go backwards, you know what I'm saying? So, but again, like Kevin had just talked about there, when you're bending time or you're bending space in order to jump from one point to another point without having to suffer the consequences of you yourself having to be impacted by a tremendous amount of time. That obviously, again, if you're an organic being, we only can live for so long, right? Unless we're in suspended animation, we don't have the luxury of just like going, well, I'm going to go travel for 100 years just the way that I am right now, because then we're going to age and be decrepit or whatnot. But if there's a way to do it without having to suffer that consequence, where it's like going to 1964 or going to 2044 is just as easy as me waking up tomorrow morning. That's a science that I would like to understand. I wouldn't mind participating in that. You know what I'm saying?
My head is trying to wrap around this, because I understand the time slowing down and the time going faster, in terms of like what already is. Like if a person took their spaceship and went somewhere where time slowed down and then came back, they might be younger than their twin who's the same age on Earth, at least like physically. And so I guess I kind of can see that as bent time. But when we talk about time traveling, we're going back to something that already occurred. That's where I start to be like, how if it already occurred? Are you finding like the wormhole that takes you, somehow it's connected to a fast, like the future space and then the previous space, but even then to get to that backward space, are you having to go at an intensely fast speed to get back to that space? Or like let's say we go forward, if you're going through that time hole, to go forward and still maintain the age that you are so that you're not going at the same speed. Because if you're going at the same pace to get to the future, then you're just existing, right? Like alongside that timeline. So to jump to that future space, you'd have to go at a hella fast pace to still be the person that you are now, the age that you are now, but still be in that normal
Right.
rate of time. And can your body even survive that
Right.
intense speed? Because we know what happens if someone goes too fast on Earth, right? With
Mhm.
G-forces. So if that's just that level, and then you have to magnify that even more just to get them to jump ahead in time. One, where do they go during that time? And two, that rate of speed that they'd have to go to be the same age that they are now, but be in that future time, would they be able to survive that? Man, my brain doesn't like this. I'm jumping off on this train station. I can get the forward a little. I don't understand the
Yeah.
backwards.
And I remember in film school, we would actually get in arguments about that with like Back to the Future. And like, I don't know if this is technically the Back to the Future paradox, but like, if you go back in time, is the past still the past, or is it actually your present? Or did you create a whole new timeline or parallel universe and you're still existing in a forward motion, but the relativeness of time is, 1950 something?
Yeah, 1955.
Well, I
Ah,
think, what
okay.
was it? In-game. Yeah, I'm going to Marvel. It didn't in-game kind of address that a little bit too. One, they said Back to the Future isn't realistic. And two, they had mentioned something like if you go back in time and you change something from that timeline, which by just going back in time, wouldn't you be changing something in that timeline? Because if you meet someone, you've affected them in a different way, right? And that can be a whole butterfly effect of things. So it's like you went back in time, at least in Endgame, they took the Infinity Stone out of the timeline and they said, okay, well, now you've created a new timeline for us. You've deviated our timeline out. In order to return us back to our regular timeline and the track that we were on, you need to bring that stone back to the exact time that you took it after you're done with it. And I was like, oh, wow, that makes sense. But then what happens to that timeline that got traveled off? Like, even if
Exactly.
you do bring the stone back and they go back on that, like that one continues on, what happens to the one that deviated off? Because time can't, or energy can't be destroyed, right? So what happens to that timeline that branched off? So many questions.
Well, I've seen it talked about, and I've seen people do a diagram before of trying to explain the possibility of traveling back in time. This is going to be hard to kind of explain. If you can imagine if you're looking at a chart and you're looking at a circle, and imagine a series of concentric circles within the circle, right? The outward circle is the timeline that you're on right now. So let's say if we're looking at a clock, 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Okay. So if we're going down to 6 o'clock, that's where we're at in our timeline. Now, if we go up to the next concentric circle, right? Almost like if you slice a tree and you look at the rings within a tree, if we follow the idea that parallel universes and wormholes connect, right? And the idea that we can never really go back to the past the way that we kind of think of it, in that series of concentric circles, from 6 o'clock where we're at, you go to the next concentric circle via a wormhole, right? Some sort of pathway connection. if we're moving forward, like, so now let's say we're at 5 o'clock position on that concentric circle, that 5 o'clock position may in fact actually be, say, 1955, even though where we were at 6 o'clock in our universe is 2021. But that the next concentric circle is actually, it's ahead of us in that timeline. It is forward of us, but it is technically the past. This is where it gets really, really heady. But it's the idea that it's almost like if everything's on a current, right? If everything rotates, if everything is just a circular wavelength in a way, where it's like we're on our timeline that it's continuing to spin around, but then there's a parallel universe that's on an, that is similar to ours, right? It is a version of ours, but its timeline is the same, except that it's at a different point than when we were. It's spinning ahead of us, even though its past is technically the future for us. It would still technically be the past as we understood what the past was. And as you keep going from ring to ring to ring, you have this same effect where different time periods may be out of sync with each other. So even though we think of it of like, well, that was 30 years ago, the next universe that you go to, you can't say that, because that 30 years is actually maybe 10 years ahead of where we're standing at right now. Again, I know it gets really, really heady, but I've seen people try to draw that out.
So it's almost like a blanket being folded over, and
Yeah.
depending where you're at in that blanket layer, it may be different relationally.
And my only problem with that is like, well, how the hell would anyone even know that? You know what I'm saying? How would anyone know where that other timeline is at? But that the core of the idea is that a parallel universe, even though it would be a mirror of our universe, its timeline is offset from where we're at right now. So you take a wheel, you spin it, take the next wheel, you spin it, take the next wheel, spin it. So, everything's like either a quarter ahead or an eighth ahead or a half ahead. You know what I'm saying? Nothing is truly parallel, meaning that we're not all standing side by side. Everything is offset. So, but I mean, that's just one concept that I've seen.
So many questions.
Exactly. Yeah. So many questions, and then again,
Just
when you
like
brought
aliens.
when you brought up aliens and Mars earlier, it's talking about like, well, what is the impact of us being on there? Within the same talk, there would be those who would be like, unless we've already been there before.
Say time travel is real and you're able to go forward, backwards, doesn't matter. Would the weight of your person cause an issue? Because like for me, 180 pounds, that's 180 pounds that's not supposed to be existing in that time or place. Would that weight have an effect for like, and possibly throw things off balance?
I guess it depends on the rules of that universe, because if it's mimicking our rules, then that shouldn't impact it, because hundreds and thousands of babies are born every day and the sum total of their weight is going to fluctuate. So what the total mass is of the earth. So I don't see that impacting, like, let's say Earth, but that's also assuming that the universe or dimension that you travel to follows the same rules of physics as ours. Now, that's the other question is, do other universes, do other dimensions, do other, I guess, systems follow the same laws? Because we're still looking at it from a very Milky Way Earth lens here, which is honestly the only way we can view things, right? Is through our experiences and our lenses and our perceptions. We try to think outside of the box, but it's still guided through those biases of what we know our world to be. So I guess that would just depend what that world's rules and physics and structure is set up as, because maybe there is no such thing as mass there, not in the way that we understand it or know it.
Yeah, the only way that I understand that, and again, it's just the things that you were kind of like taught or had been theorized throughout our lives, was the whole concept that if you were to travel in time and you were to meet yourself, that you are effectively the same matter, and that the two matters cannot come in contact with each other. If they come in contact with each other, that they annihilate each other. That's the only way that I have ever heard of there being some kind of a problem about removing yourself from this time location into another time location was, in fact, if you were to come in contact with yourself.
I always kind of found issue with that theory because I understand the conundrum of having two of the exact same thing on the exact same timeline, but is it then the exact same thing? Because are you really the exact same? As we age or as we're exposed to different environments, our own genetic coding changes, right? Our stuff changes over time. We adapt, we disease, and everything else that we're introduced to changes us in microscopic particle level ways. So are we the exact same? If I meet the version of me that was 20 years ago or 30 years in the future, I don't think that I am. And so I don't think it's the exact same thing. I wonder if that conundrum and that possibility only exists if I time blipped to the exact same moment in time and met the person that is right there. And then it's like we are the exact same person on a cellular level, genetic level, DNA level, blah, blah, blah. But when we're talking about going back in time or going in the future and meeting yourself, I don't see that being an issue because I don't think it's the exact same person on a cellular level. And on top of that, if it's like they're not allowed to exist in the same universe, I don't think meeting would be a factor. I think just two beings of the exact same, whatever scope existing at the same time would cause the issue. And then I don't think they'd necessarily have to meet. It would just be the fact that both are in that same universe at the exact same time.
I was just going to say something. You brought up something that just clicked in my head. You brought up microscopic, and right there, when I stop and think about that, to me, that's an example of a parallel universe already existing within our own. If you looked at any of the photography that's done on a microscopic level, where you see microorganisms that look like they're creatures right out of Dune or something like that, if you can imagine that you were to be shrunk down to that size, that is a whole other universe that exists. There are these monsters, when you look at them, that are existing on our bodies, right? And if you were to shrink yourself down to that size, your worldview would be, you'd be like looking at these titans that look like monsters. And what would your sky even look like? The ground you walk on, which would be organic flesh, what would that seem like? So to me, sorry, but you just brought up something there that just made me like go, well, wait a minute, that's kind of a parallel universe already existing with us right now.
That just made me think of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
I was going to go somewhere different with that. I was going to go with Inner Space.
Yeah.
With Randy Quaid. Randy Quaid? Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, no,
from the 80s. Was
Dennis
it Dennis?
Quaid.
Dennis. Yeah. Dennis. Randy's the other one. Yeah. But that was another good movie too.
That was something I always found an issue with that movie Frequency with Dennis Quaid. They were talking to each other because of the Aurora Borealis and like a faulty radio. He was talking to his dad who had passed away, and he's able to talk to him as an adult because of some radio and like an Aurora Borealis because there's something magical about it apparently. I know that they kind of go through that radio and change time, and it keeps like fucking up things in the future. Like suddenly his mom's dead, or suddenly something has changed in his timeline because of what his dad's doing in the past based on the information that he's giving him. And at the end, he's able to make it to where, and spoiler if you've never seen this, he's able to make it where his dad stays alive and his mom's still alive and all is well, his happy childhood, but he's still the same person. And I'm wondering, like, is that realistic? And I always had a problem with that because I'm like, if your dad stayed alive and you're still the you that remembers talking to your dad on the radio, I get how his dad would remember that because the timeline of him that existed went through that and explored that and lived through that, right? But for him being in the present and talking to the past and knowing his dad had died and knowing then that he caused his mom to die and then his dad lived, where do those memories come from then? And would he still be the same person? Because he remembers the version where his dad died and the version where his mom died and like all of those memories. And it just makes me wonder, like, wouldn't that have changed his entire timeline too, though? He went on the path that he went on because he didn't have his dad growing up. And so then if it's like, okay, your dad, you saved your dad lived, wouldn't that change your memories so that your dad was present in your life? And did that then change your path and what you did?
Going into DC, I mean, when Barry Allen, the Flash, he goes back and saves his mom, creates a whole paradox and everything. Going with the TV show, I didn't really read the comics, but I know it's part of the comics too. He goes, he saves his mom, and a couple of people that he knows, like they had a daughter in one reality, and then after he saved his mom, they didn't have the daughter, they had a son instead. And he remembers that, but obviously they don't know anything about it. So it's just, yeah.
Then you'd have to ask yourself, like, do you keep that information to yourself or do you share it?
Right. And I think at one point he actually brought it up and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, I didn't have, yeah. So,
Well, for me, I think, again, for all of this, I just keep coming back to that I'm not arrogant enough to think that I accept that we as a species have the answers to everything. I think about the possibility that all of these things could very well be real and that they could be possible. And then even when I go back and I look at things historically, when you talk about like ancient shaman, and when they would talk about that they would go into either whether it's through a kind of meditation state or if it was drug induced or whatnot, but that they would have a communion with beings who seem to exist on another dimension and stuff like that. And and this we're talking about during an age where there's no technology. Supposedly, there's no spaceships, there's no particle accelerators or anything like that. Uh, but even back then, they had a concept and understanding of energy and space and time. So I feel like the idea of black holes or parallel universes or wormholes or alternate dimensions, I think it's all on the table. I totally accept that any of it is possible. I can't bring myself to be arrogant enough to think that it's not.
Well, and thinking about ancient shaman, I mean, think about the concept of astral projection, like opening up that Pandora's box. What if that's just a different, people laugh at it, that's not real, that's just sci-fi, but what if that is just a different way of transportation? Or it's something that is real that people are capable of doing, that they're able to separate from their organic matter in a way, still be connected to it through maybe dark matter, but still kind of extend it out and through that dark matter ether. What if astral projection is an extension of dark matter that we can't see and record yet, that people are able to do, not a lot, but some, and still stay connected to that visible matter in some way and then return to it? Maybe the part of our brain that we don't use or know yet is dark matter, is tuned to dark matter. The yin and the yang, right? Our universe is comprised of dark and light matter. Why is it then maybe it's not a stretch that we are comprised of light and dark matter? We just don't know how to tap into that yet. And maybe those that are like metaphysical sensitive are able to do things like astral projection or commune to other beings or dimensions or universes, are tapping into that dark matter and using that as an extension of themselves.
I'm just going to say it. My brain wrinkle is not big enough for all this.
Yeah, this is the stuff I geek out on and I love it. So this has been an amazing episode, and I love that this is wrapping us up for the season, because this is just a phenomenal topic with so many possibilities. And I really appreciate and love that you were able to come on and join us for this, David. You are, as usual, amazing and phenomenal, and we all love you. I hope you will come back to join us on season 2.
Well, number one, well, thank you. I mean, you're way too kind. I'm just a guy, and I think about these same things. I don't have any answers or anything like that. But absolutely, anytime that you guys would be nice enough to have me on, I'm more than eager and happy to do so.
Thank you so much for coming back. This was amazing.
Yes, thank you very much. We appreciate you so much. Well, everybody, I hope we haven't hurt your head too much like our own talking about this subject. Like Ashley said, thank you, David, for coming on. We appreciate you. We appreciate all of our listeners. Stay tuned for season 2, definitely. If you haven't done so already, please, everybody, follow us on our social media. If you have any questions, comments, or any episode suggestions, please email us at 3hauntedpodcast@gmail.com. And this is your co-host, John Thomas.
And I think I'm still Kevin K. Daddy.
And I am always Ashley Lunar Goddess.
Thank you guys very much. Stay tuned for season 2.
3Haunted, signing off.